Welcome to Asia Unlocked, where we cover current events and emerging trends in Asia. Today I'm joined by Mr. Dennis Wilder. Mr. Wilder is a senior fellow of the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and an assistant professor of practice here at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Additionally, he is a visiting professor of the practice at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government. Prior to his current role, he held several positions in government. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Wilder served as Chief of China Analysis at the CIA. Under the George W. Bush administration, he first served as the National Security Council's Director of China, and then as a National Security Council's Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asian Affairs. Finally, during the Obama administration, he served as the Senior Editor of the President's Daily Brief and served as the CIA's Deputy Director for East Asia and the Pacific. With that introduction out of the way, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to discussing the recent events surrounding Zhang Youxia's removal.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's great to be with you today.
Of course. So I think we'll start simple. Can you provide an overview of recent events? What happened? Who is Zhang Youxia, and why should listeners care?
I have called this a stunning event, and I mean it. I have studied the Chinese military ever since I was a junior in college at Chinese University of Hong Kong. And frankly, I've never seen anything like this in party-army relations before. What has happened is, for whatever reason, and we can get into these, President Xi Jinping has decided to clear out the rot, as it has been called, in the Chinese military leadership. What that means is there is only one member of the Central Military Commission left, not even a combat arms officer, but only a political commissar who has been involved in the investigations of all these other officers. So it would be as if the entire American Joint Chiefs of Staff was taken out. The surprise was not that an anti-corruption campaign occurred, because this has happened in the military over and over again since 2012. The surprise was that Zhang Youxia, who was removed last week, was very close to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping had promoted him into the position of the top military officer in China. Zhang Youxia had supported the military modernization campaigns of Xi Jinping. Their fathers were close during the Revolutionary era. They're both red princelings. And so why did this occur? And we don't have the answer. Frankly, the Chinese charges against Zhang Youxia, as relayed in People's Liberation Army Daily, are vague. They talk about corruption, but they also talk about Zhang Youxia somehow having trampled on the CMC chairman's responsibility system. Now, the CMC chairman's responsibility system refers directly to Xi Jinping. So the fundamental question here is, what did Zhang Youxia do that Xi Jinping considered disloyal? Was it political? Was it policy related to Taiwan? Was it corruption? Or was he just too slow to modernize and change the Chinese military? Was he not aggressive enough on the Taiwan question? There are a million different ways to look at this, and if you look at the work being done by various scholars right now, everybody's advancing theories, but frankly, we just don't know.
I think that's a good segue into my next question, where I'll ask you to evaluate some of the theories.
Okay.
So there are several competing theories about what happened. First, you've argued in previous interviews that Xi may have removed Zhang due to fear that he was gaining influence and might block his chances of securing a fourth term in 2027. On the other hand, the South China Morning Post argues that corruption may have been a genuine concern, noting that while corruption charges aren't uncommon, as you said, accusations of budget tampering in particular are especially rare. And then finally, Jamestown recently released a report arguing Zhang's purge may be a question of PLA readiness and Zhang under-delivering in terms of a joint training, citing the PLA Daily as saying the investigation constitutes a stout and powerful push to win the critical battle and achieve the PLA's centenary goal. What are your thoughts? If there is one theory, do you think there's one theory that best explains the situation, or as you said, do you think this is something we simply can't understand completely?
my career has been in analysis and the tradecraft of analysis. And in analysis, what you have to do is take the facts that you can work with, and then you have to do a certain amount of speculating from there. In the CIA, we often refer to this as the puzzle with pieces missing. That you're given a puzzle to work with. You don't have the picture on the cover to work from. Some of the pieces are missing, and some of the pieces don't fit the puzzle. And that's what we're dealing with here. And so we are in a situation where you have to use your best analytic judgment, you have to use tradecraft, you have to think through and structured techniques. So let me try and go through this a little bit. So let us start with the corruption question. First of all, there's no question of deep, abiding corruption within the Chinese military. It has been there for decades. Different leaders have tried to weed it out. Xi Jinping has taken on the most aggressive campaign since 2012, with the support of the rest of the leadership, to clean out corruption. But one thing that has been noticed is that he has tended to clean out corruption of people who he considers rivals and save the people that are on his team, if you will. What has changed at this point, it seems that he's decided in the PLA that he's going after everybody on corruption. And then the question becomes, is this really a matter of corruption, or is there another reason for this? The second area, of course, is the one that I've been talking most about, which is the question of, is this a political problem? That after the PLA was cleaned out and all the rest of the Central Military Commission was gone, there was only one man standing, really, and that's Zhang Youxia. This would give Zhang Youxia incredible power. Xi Jinping obviously is giving every indication that he wants to be president for life. Well, in 2027, the party has to do this pseudo re-election of him. There may be people who are saying within the party, and in fact, I know there are people in the party saying this, why doesn't he appoint successors? Hu Jintao appointed successors. In fact, Xi Jinping was one of those. Jiang Zemin appointed successors. Deng Xiaoping appointed successors. Why are we in this abnormal situation where there are no successors? Secondly, he has accumulated all the power within the Chinese system. Should he remain having all of those positions, or could some of that be diversified to other people? The argument would be that Xi Jinping, rather than creating stability within the Chinese system, actually is creating instability by not having a succession plan. He may believe he can live till 80 or 90 years of age. I'm sure he hopes that. But that may not happen. And I think the leadership has to be a bit nervous about this. Zhang Youxia might have been one of those people that people turn to coalesce within the party. One of the things we don't understand very well about the Chinese system is there is a great deal of dynamic within the party. There are a great deal of pressures within the party that we don't get to see because the party is very good at keeping their internal deliberations quiet. And so we don't know what is happening on this issue of Xi Jinping and lifelong leadership. The third area you mentioned, which is a very interesting one, that Tristan Tang in particular in Taipei is pushing as a theory, is this idea that Zhang Youxia, as an old curmudgeon of the Chinese military, may not have been moving fast enough on Xi Jinping's directive that by 2027, China should be ready, the Chinese military should be ready for a conflict on the Taiwan Strait. Perhaps Zhang Youxia doesn't really believe that China should take military action. But again, this is speculation. We just don't know. I think the one big question that keeps going through my mind when I'm looking at these theories is Xi Jinping could have easily retired Zhang Youxia. Zhang Youxia could have had a political illness, right? This happens all the time in a system like the Chinese autocratic system. What was the reason that he needed to humiliate him For 3 days running in the People's Liberation Army Daily, there were very aggressive articles against Zhang Youxia. To me, it looked like the message was trying to be sent to the military that the man you love is taken down and you better fall into line. And that suggests to me something of a political problem for Xi Jinping. Again, if he had just wanted to deal with corruption, if he had just wanted to deal with a leader who wasn't moving forward with his plans, an easy, quiet retirement seems to me would have been the logical choice. Instead of giving the world this rather uncomfortable feeling that something's going on in China that is abnormal.
That's great. And I actually have a couple of follow-up questions. So first, I want to go back to the so what. So you mentioned before that this is an incredibly complex issue. We cannot know possibly what's actually happening, and the party is very opaque. Given the difficulty of unpacking and analyzing the situation, why should people be interested? Why should we continue to persevere in understanding what's happening and why it's happening?
Because the status of the Chinese military is an enormously important question. We know that Beijing is impatient over the Taiwan situation. We see Chinese military aircraft flying every day around Taiwan in a gray zone coercive campaign. Chinese ships are constantly patrolling near Taiwan. It is obvious that the military is a very big part of Chinese, if you will, diplomacy on the Taiwan question. It is part of Chinese diplomacy in the South China Sea. It is part of its diplomacy toward Japan. The increasing Chinese military capabilities increase the danger of conflict. And so the question of stability within the Chinese military, proficiency within the Chinese military, readiness within the Chinese military is an enormously important question to the United States, our command in the Pacific, but also to the Japanese, to the Koreans, to the Philippines, to Taiwan, to all of East Asia. And you can believe that in every capital right now, they are asking exactly the same questions that we are asking here in Washington. This is one of the key questions that has to be dealt with.
Definitely. And another point I want to touch on that you mentioned previously has to do with the accumulation of power versus the diversification of power. And you talked about how the accumulation of power could breed instability within the CCP. Different arguments. Some have said that, in particular for the military, the centralization of authority leads to more efficiency. But some have made the argument that Xi's centralization of power, combined with his lack of military experience, may hinder the PLA. Can you walk us through a bit more why the centralization of authority might hurt or hinder the party, especially the PLA?
I called it in an article I wrote for the Financial Times, authoritarian overreach. And I think there is a danger that when an authoritarian takes all power to themselves, it disrupts the system. What do I mean by that? First of all, when you are all powerful, do you get dissenting views? Unlikely. Do you get the best advice from people? Unlikely. When these people become so authoritarian, the system no longer functions as well to provide you with accurate information and accurate advice. I think we can turn in history to Chairman Mao when he became all powerful and launched the Cultural Revolution. Nobody stopped him. Nobody was able to stop him. Stalin and his purges. You have Hitler and the Night of the Long Knives. When you do this in a system, when you don't let, to use Mao's term, 100 flowers bloom, you get a problem. And I would argue that that is the problem we are now seeing today. What military officer today, if they are appointed into the Central Military Commission, is going to dare to say anything that is in the slightest bit critical?
I think that's an interesting point. And before I touch on the last thing you mentioned earlier, I actually want to ask a follow-up question. So, with authoritarian overreach disrupting the system because there are no dissenting views or accurate information, what do you think she will do next in terms of structuring the CMC? Some analysts have argued that there will be no replacements, given the fact that there is only she and his companion. Some have made the arguments that he'll install loyalists. What do you think he'll do next? Or is it hard to tell what he'll do next?
Well, this is one of the most fun guessing games for us who follow the Chinese military. And I've been going through my files to try and pick out future leaders. One group I'm looking at is the officers that Xi Jinping has been sending to Russia for command and general staff school. So each year, a few officers are handpicked to go to Russia to study at the various academies, whether it's Naval Academy, Air Force Academy, or Army Academy, Freunze. And so I'm looking at that group and seeing, frankly, who's survived and trying to figure out which of these might be in line. I think another group he is likely to turn to is the Air Force and the Navy. Given that this has really been an Army problem, quite specifically, Zhang Youxia, He Weidong, Miao Hua, all come from green backgrounds, infantry backgrounds. He may feel that in order to get a fresh group of officers, that he moves to the Air Force and the Navy. For example, for the military parade, the anti-Japan military parade that occurred in September, the officer in charge was surprisingly not a 3-star, but a 2-star, and he was an Air Force officer, which was highly unusual. I think that man has a very good chance of being on the Central Military Commission. He was also promoted in December to a 3-star. He is now head of the Central Command. I think he could easily move on to the Military Commission. So I'm looking for these kinds of people. Obviously, he's going to be looking for loyalists. But, Eric, let's look at another problem Xi Jinping has had. He sacked his foreign minister, Qin Gang, 2 years ago. Who's the foreign minister today? There really isn't one. Wang Yi is substituting as foreign minister. So for 2 years, he hasn't been able to fill that position. Does he have a slate of candidates already prepared to step in? Or is he going to struggle to figure out who is loyal and who is not? Remember that he is now going to sweat Zhang Youxia and the other officers. They're going to interrogate them endlessly, frankly, in little rooms where they're very uncomfortable, and their networks are going to be investigated. And so Xi Jinping may not be prepared initially until he knows the networks to decide who he thinks he can trust and who he can't. So again, right now, this is a pretty unstable situation.
I want to follow up on the last thing you just said about sweating Zhang, interrogating his networks. You also mentioned before that the investigation was also meant to send a signal to the people in Zhang's party. I'm wondering, given Zhang's influence in the PLA, what impact, if any, do you think this would have on PLA readiness, PLA morale? How might the people in Zhang's party be reacting? How might that implicate the military writ large?
I wouldn't call it a party, it's a network. It's a network of people that he has been their mentor and guidance to over his career. And remember, we're talking about a man who has been a Chinese commanding officer since 1984. And throughout that period, he has been cultivating relationships, building relationships. So he has an enormous network of followers within the PLA. This is why I think they had to do 3 articles in a row on the front page of the People's Daily criticizing Zhang Youxia. Because all of those officers are feeling very uncomfortable, wondering if they are the next head to roll, wondering what they should do. And so I think that this is a problem of paralysis for the PLA right now. Doesn't mean it has to last forever. Obviously, once they're done with the investigations, once they have taken into custody those officers that they feel are disloyal, they can rebuild. And there is an argument made that Xi Jinping will have the opportunity to rebuild the military in his own image. That maybe the new PLA commanding officers will be younger, better trained, more technological. As I said, some of them having gone to Russia, having gone and actually seen the Ukraine conflict. So there's a chance that the PLA comes out stronger. I'm not discounting that possibility at all.
I think that might be one of the most comprehensive overviews of the issue and the implications I've heard yet. I want to move on to a different but related topic. In previous interviews, you've talked about the structural tension between civilian leaders and the military. From the outside looking in, like you mentioned before, due to the opacity, it might be difficult to recognize the tensions that exist within the CCP. I'm wondering if you could build upon what you said before about that structural tension.
Right.
Why is there structural tension? What factors contribute to that tension? And is there a way that Xi can overcome those obstacles?
Well, as you know, Eric, you took my course on this subject. And I maintain that tension started in 1927 with the founding of the People's Liberation Army as an arm of the party. What that meant is these two organizations, symbiotic. They have to exist together. The army is an arm of the party, and they have to work together. But what you find in Chinese communist history is that the PLA offers to the party what Andrew Scoville and others have called conditional compliance. In other words, yes, we will be your army. Yes, we support the party in what you need us to do. But you have obligations back to the army. And one of those has been over the years a desire for non-interference in army affairs, getting the resources that the army needs. And this sense of obligation can cause tensions because there are points in history where obviously the civilian leadership had other priorities. And at that point, frankly, the army turned to corruption. It turned to making money on its own, as it did in the Jiang Zemin era. And so there is a tension in this system, inherent in this system, because these are the two great institutions of Chinese communism. And let's remember that Zhang Youxia was not just the top military commander. He was also a member of the Politburo of China. He was a party senior official as well as a military senior official. And this has happened over and over again in Chinese communist history, that these two are not as separated as people would like to think. And it is not a vertical relationship. It's a horizontal relationship. And so I can enumerate lots of different moments of this. Peng Dehuai in 1958, when he confronted Mao on the fact that the Great Leap Forward was killing families and his soldiers were sending him letters. He stood up and defied Mao at that moment because he thought Mao was wrong. Now, consequently, Mao purged him. There have been many other moments of tension between the party and the army. And it seems to me that it is simply inevitable.
I like the phrase conditional compliance. I think that dynamic is useful for understanding the underlying situation or dynamics that might be shaping or influencing Xi's decision-making process. My next question, I actually would like to ask you to comment on a debate that's happening right now with regard to Zhang Youxia's purge. So some have argued that the purge makes an attack on Taiwan less likely, given the lack of decision-making capacity, thus giving the US more time to prepare. However, some argue that the PLA still has competent senior officers and formidable capabilities, which means we shouldn't doubt China's willingness to make a move against Taiwan in the near future. What are your thoughts?
You know, Eric, I'm going to violate a rule that I taught you in my course. I told you that an analyst should never say in the president's daily brief that it is too soon to tell. I'm going to tell you right now that it is way too soon to answer this question. We need to see how quickly Xi Jinping can recreate the command structure, the officer corps, what he does in terms of advancing the military modernization, advancing the situation on the Taiwan Strait. One thing we do know is Chinese units are disciplined and capable. That doesn't change because of this leadership decapitation. Navy commanders still know how to do their jobs. Air Force commanders know what they're doing. Missile commanders know what they're doing. From an operational standpoint, the PLA is still capable of carrying out its missions. That has not changed. From a command standpoint, that's where the problem is, and that's what we've got to look at to come up with an assessment. So I'm going to disappoint you and say, I don't know. I don't know yet. I wish I could answer the question, but sometimes you just have to say, as I taught you in the course on writing a president's daily brief, I'm sorry, we don't have the answer yet.
I think sometimes that is the best answer. And I think one thing you mentioned actually provides the best segue into my final question for you. So you said that while there may be some command challenges, the PLA is not weaker operationally. And I think that is a useful point to think about because some analysts have mentioned or talked about how in order to demonstrate strength during times of perceived weakness, the PLA may posture. The PLA may use its military to demonstrate that it is not weaker despite moments of internal crisis. Some analysts have noted similar dynamics during COVID, where there was increased activity in the South China Sea to demonstrate that during a time of crisis, the PLA still remains capable. Given the current crisis that is Zhang Youxia's removal, do you think that there is a possibility that the PLA postures in order to demonstrate strength? And if so, what flashpoint or issue in the Indo-Pacific might provide a platform for the PLA to demonstrate its strength?
Well, if I was still in government and advising the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Paparo, I would say watch out against the Philippines, Vietnam, and the Senkakus. I think that there might be an inclination on Xi Jinping's part to try to show strength, try to show muscle against a weaker opponent. And certainly the Philippines fits that criteria. And so I could see that happening. We also need to watch this air activity near Taiwan and the naval activity. Does it increase in this period? Does it decrease in this period? Or does it stay about the same? And that could be an indicator of whether Xi Jinping feels he needs to, again, flex some muscle.
That makes sense. And I think that is the perfect end to our first episode. It sounds like we'll need to keep a close eye on Xi's next steps. What does he do in the CMC? Does anyone fill those vacant positions? And also, what will the PLA do in the region? With that being said, thank you for joining us and sharing your comprehensive assessment of the situation.
It was great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. We hope you join us in tracking emerging events across the Asia Pacific and join us for our next episode of Asia Unlocked.